Hey guys, it's late on Sunday night, and I'm getting this lecture recorded for you guys. This is the last one that I'm going to be doing. I know you guys are so sad, but it's the last lecture for the year officially, because there's an assignment that you guys can see if you look on Canvas, an optional assignment. Just a heads up, if you are passing my class right now with flying colors, you do not have to do the final assignment. If you are not passing or you're kind of on the verge, the final assignment, it's actually kind of a cool, fun, you sort of are like creating like historical documents based on your time during the pandemic, but um, the that final assignment can only help your grade, and you have to do it if you're not passing my class, because it can hopefully get you to the spot that you need to be. But anyway, so yeah, this is the last one. I'm going to jump right into it. This one shouldn't be too long. I'm thinking maybe it'll be about 10 or 12 minutes, not counting what I just said to you. So let's just jump right into it. So far, or like the last 2 weeks, we've done the war in Europe, but we talked about how that ended with Hitler committing suicide and the Third Reich coming to an end. But the war was not over, because even though Italy and Germany had surrendered at this point, Japan was still in it, and Japan was still fighting. And I mentioned in the last lecture that they were fighting mostly with the United States, a little bit with Australia. We're not going to really talk about them much. But they were fighting mostly with the United States in the Pacific. And so they're the ones that hung on in the war the longest. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. Just as a refresher, the whole reason that this is still sort of like, World War II is still raging on is because Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Surprise attacked, and that's officially what pulled the United States into the war. So that action is kind of what started this whole kind of Pacific theater. If you guys remember, theater just means like an area that the war is being fought. So, we already kind of mentioned this when we talked about the rape of Nanking. But after Japan took over China, you guys can see here, these are photographs from the rape of Nanking. But after Japan took over China, even though there were guerrillas that were still fighting there, Japan just kind of continued to build their Pacific Empire, fueled by a lot of resources they were taking from China and then from Korea. Pretty much everywhere that they took over, they used and took resources from. There's a long history of Japanese treatment of people in those regions, specifically the women. Actually, Korea, it's kind of history has documented like their use of comfort women and sort of using Korean women for the Japanese soldiers. And there's like just a lot of documentation of really brutal treatment. They took over the Philippines from the United States. It was technically a colony of the United States, but much closer to Japan, and the United States was not really in a position to defend it. And so they took over the Pacific Islands. I mean, it was just like the Japanese by far were the strongest in the region and just kept taking island by island. And there wasn't really anyone that could stop them. Not even at this point the United States, because the United States is gearing up and mobilizing for war, but we were really wounded because of Pearl Harbor, at least our Pacific Fleet was, and we were also concentrating a lot of our attention on Germany and the fight over in Europe. One of the reasons it's really important to note that the Japanese were so brutal towards people that surrendered is because of, so as they took each of these places, like as they took the Philippines, there were American soldiers stationed there that surrendered. Except for traditional Japanese culture, they believe it's dishonorable to surrender. So in battle, it was just considered a very dishonorable thing. You were supposed to fight to the death. That's what you signed up for as a soldier. And if you surrendered, then it was just seen as very dishonorable. They had their traditional ritual suicide, seppuku, where you would, well, the official form is where you would actually take your own knife and stab yourself in the stomach and drag it across your stomach. It's a very slow, painful, gruesome death, but that was like the traditional form. There were also many like military commanders that instead of surrendering would have like their maybe second in command behead them, as opposed to being captured by the enemy. So when they captured American soldiers or anybody that surrendered, even though that's not American culture, that's not necessarily the culture of the places that they were taking over, they still saw these POWs or prisoners of war in a very dishonorable light. They just thought that they were cowards for having surrendered. One example of that was the Bataan March, where in the Philippines they actually had all of the American POWs march 50 miles to this camp that they were going to be keeping them in, and they buried some of the men alive. There were all these photographs of them beheading soldiers. There were 70,000 prisoners that they took, and only 54,000 survived. But even the people who survived, you can look up photographs of survivors of the Bataan March. It's pretty wild to see just like what their bodies went through, and wild that even that many survived. So Japan was very, very brutal and aggressive, and they were very open about documenting all of it. So the world kind of knew what Japan was doing. And the United States, was feeling very obviously bitter from this attack on Pearl Harbor, and they're wanting to strike back. So they launched, Doolittle was the commander, and he actually took 16 pilots. You guys can see them here in this photograph. And they got into their airplanes and they flew. They launched from an aircraft carrier close to Japan. However, it wasn't actually very close at all, but close enough where they could make it to Japan and then hopefully come back to the aircraft carrier, except for they actually couldn't get as close as they wanted because of fear that Japan would see them, and so they actually had to take off a lot further back than they intended, and so the pilots actually had to crash land in China, and some of them were captured by the Japanese, remember, because Japan had controlled parts of China, but some of them were helped by local Chinese people to escape from China. So the raid, it doesn't really do that much damage, but it does raise the morale of Americans, because we bombed Tokyo, which was the capital of Japan. So Americans are feeling pretty, at least like, we could hit them at home where it hurt, even though it didn't really do too much damage. And so this kind of just like sets off this, I guess just like rivalry and battle between the United States and Japan's winning. There's actually all these fortifications. If you guys walk up by San Francisco, by Land's End, you can see where we had machine gun turrets and all these things. We were prepared for Japan to make it to the West Coast, but there's a couple battles I'm going to talk to you guys about where the United States was like successful in stopping them. The Battle of the Coral Sea. Here's where I'm going to talk about Australia. Australia and American ships or aircraft carriers versus Japanese aircraft carriers. The interesting thing about this battle is this battle was fought completely, it was completely fought in the air. So it was like a naval battle because they're launching from aircraft carriers, but it was all just launching the planes and then them fighting from the air. The reason it's significant is because this is the first time that Japan's southward advance was stopped. So this is the first time that Japan was kind of like halted. Before they had just been taking everything. So it was kind of a pretty close battle in terms of like who lost what, but at least they stopped Japan's southward advance. And then this next battle, the Battle of Midway, they actually just made a film about this, which is kind of interesting. The Allies had broken the Japanese code, so they had received intelligence that they thought that they might be attacking this really strategic strip of land in the Pacific called Midway. And so they intercepted news of the attack, and so they actually positioned themselves so when Japan kind of like came over the horizon, the United States had already launched all their planes off of their aircraft carriers. And so they caught the Japanese by surprise. The Japanese had no idea that the United States knew they were going to attack this island. And so here's the problem if you look at this. If you get an aircraft carrier caught by surprise, it's bad news because you have to wait. These pilots in the back have to wait for this pilot to launch. Right? You can't all just it's not a helicopter. You can't just pick up. And so if your aircraft carrier gets caught by surprise, it's really bad. And this significant thing is that the United States destroys 332 Japanese planes and 4 aircraft carriers. And from this point on, you guys, the United States starts getting closer and closer and closer to Japan. So you guys can see they begin this island hopping campaign. So they kind of like strategically choose which islands to attack and which to kind of stay away from. And so literally they're like hopping from island to island. And they're mostly like avoiding some of the like Japanese strongholds where the Japanese are really like dug in and fortified. So Japan is on the retreat. America is pushing them closer and closer towards Japan. There's a couple strategic battles we'll talk about next year, like Okinawa and I'm blanking on the other one, Guadalcanal, and just a few of these really significant, Iwo Jima is another one, battles. But the United States, so you're going to need this information for your assignment. The United States, at this point in time, successfully tests the atomic bomb. We'll talk more about that actual project next year, but they successfully test the first atomic bomb. So they have a decision to make. Americans, the first reason why they claim that they dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is because they were really afraid of fighting a ground battle in Japan. They were terrified. They knew Japan did not surrender. Like, Japan didn't surrender on these random islands they had taken over. Do you think they're going to actually surrender their homeland? So, one, Americans were really afraid that Japan would just never surrender and the war would get drug out forever. Two, they feared that this was going to cost enormous amounts of, one, American lives in the military, and two, money. Because if you're fighting this endless war and Japan is across the ocean, it's incredibly expensive. So that was another big fear of theirs. And then three, a lot of people were like, this is revenge. Japan pulled us into the war in the first place, so we're getting revenge against them. They also treated our prisoners of war terribly, and were open about it, and so they saw this as revenge. So the United States, President Truman gets on the news and warns Japan and says, we're going to destroy you or rain ruin on you from the sky. Which, if you're at war with somebody and they tell you we're going to bomb you, you're like, well, yeah, we're at war. Like, you probably don't think anything of it. So they warn them, and they hear nothing from Japan. So 3 days later, Hiroshima, the first atomic bomb, is dropped. 70,000 are killed almost instantly in Hiroshima. President Truman then gets on again and says, "Do you surrender, Japan?" And still silence. And so 3 days later, Nagasaki is bombed. Here you guys can see some photographs of the devastation. Here's the kind of like classic mushroom cloud. You guys can see people's skin. People were evaporated on the spot. People's skin was like dripping from their bodies. It was absolutely terrible, absolutely miserable. And this does not even account for all of the like lingering effects of atomic bombs that we didn't know about, like radiation. So the assignment that you guys are working on, you're going to actually look at Emperor Hirohito's address to the Japanese nation after that second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. It's really significant because the Emperor of Japan never spoke. The people of Japan did not see him. They did not know what his voice sounded like. He was like too holy to really like interact with the people. They always heard from the military generals or, people that worked for the emperor. They never directly heard from the emperor. The emperor gets on the radio and he addresses the Japanese people and tells them, "We have no choice but to surrender." And so actually from that point, after they heard that, there was actually thousands of Japanese people that actually committed suicide after this because they were like, "There's no way that we can surrender." And so it's kind of interesting, but I want you guys to look at his address and I want you to answer the questions. Make sure you do so thoughtfully. And this, you guys, is officially how World War II comes to an end, and that's where we're going to end class this year. Usually we'd go into the Cold War, which starts directly after, but that'll have to wait till next year. So, yeah, that's it.